again, Year 11, and welcome to your final lesson looking at exam technique for Weimar, Germany as part of our History Revision programme. Now remember that the sixth lesson of the week is going to be actual exam, where you will be having a go at 6 questions for Weimar, Germany. Now ultimately, these lessons are here to help you practice for that exam, and you can go back over them at any time. Today's lesson is going to be completely focused on the question 6 exam technique. Now question 6 is the largest question on the paper. It's worth 12 marks. And it always asks you about 2 different factors, and it will ask you which one of them is the most important in looking at a certain topic. So this question, because it's worth 12 marks, it should take you 15 minutes to answer in total. And you will need to make sure that you write 3 detailed paragraphs in which you do show off your knowledge and you make a judgment at the end. So your first 2 paragraphs will be about the 2 factors in the question. You will need to make sure that you are giving lots of detail about those factors, as it is worth 12 marks, and you will also need to make sure that you link back to the question at the end of each paragraph before making a final judgment in your conclusion, which will be your 3rd paragraph. You also need to make sure that you are adding specific facts and figures as part of your knowledge. And as I've already mentioned, detailed explanation is essential too. So this slide shows you our question 6, example 1. This is one that we're going to go through together, and I'm going to show you a model answer for this question as well. So the question is, which of the following had the greater impact on the German people? Was it the Treaty of Versailles or the hyperinflation crisis? So first of all, I just want to quickly talk to you about how we're going to approach this question. So first of all, it is 3 paragraphs. Now the first paragraph will be all about the Treaty of Versailles. We'll give some examples of what was agreed in the treaty, and we'll also talk about how that affected the German people, because that's linking back to the question. For the second paragraph, I'm going to talk about hyperinflation, why it was a crisis, what happened, and how again did it affect the German people. And then finally, we will do a conclusion for our 3rd paragraph. In the conclusion, I'll need to make it very clear which of these I find had the greater impact on the German people. Was it the Treaty of Versailles, or was it the hyperinflation crisis? And I'll need to make sure that I justify my opinion with some explanation. So let's have a look at this as a model answer, as 3 paragraphs. Here's an example of a model answer for the 12-mark question, which of the following had the greater impact on the German people? Was it the Treaty of Versailles or hyperinflation? So I'm just going to read through this answer first of all, and then we'll pick out some things that we need to make sure we're doing every time we write one of these questions. So listen up. The Treaty of Versailles had a devastating impact on the German people. They had already suffered in World War I, and the treaty compounded their losses. Millions of Germans were now living under foreign rule in France, Belgium, Poland or Czechoslovakia. They also had to accept the blame and shame for starting the war. Many in Germany were especially angry about this, as they blamed Russia for starting the war. On top of war debt, they now had to pay 6.6 billion in reparations over 66 years. Secondly, reparations were placing an economic strain on the country, causing inflation. Germany had paid the first instalment, but in January 1933, the Germans defaulted on their reparation payments. France invaded the Ruhr to take what was owed to them according to the treaty, and the government called a general strike to resist. 132 Germans were killed, and 150,000 were evicted from their homes and expelled from the region. Loss of production, together with printing money to pay the strikers, caused hyperinflation, which went on to have a huge impact on the people of Germany. Hyperinflation almost led to the collapse of Weimar Germany. The first problem caused by hyperinflation was economic and social. From the start of 1923, prices rose, bread went up from 1 to 200 billion marks. The value of a pound went up from 500 to 14 trillion marks. People got their wages in wheelbarrows. Money was used as a toy or fuel. People on fixed incomes like pensioners, war widows and people with savings were ruined. There was social chaos, riots and looting. Hyperinflation also caused political unrest. There were a number of rebellions. One of the most serious issues was the Nazi Munich Putsch in November 1923. Hitler had planned a rebellion in Bavaria with the support of the other right-wing politicians, including the governor of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr. When Kahr hesitated, Hitler and 600 stormtroopers burst into a meeting in a beer hall where Kahr was speaking and forced him at gunpoint to declare rebellion. The next day, the Nazis with General Ludendorff marched on Munich. The Nazis were defeated in a shotgun battle, and 16 were killed, and Hitler was arrested. Therefore, hyperinflation had a big impact on the lives of the German people. Both events had a huge impact on the German people, but I think that the hyperinflation crisis had the greater impact. Even though it could be argued that the Treaty of Versailles caused the issues which went on to trigger hyperinflation, such as the invasion of the Ruhr, I would argue that hyperinflation itself affected people all over Germany, from pensioners having to return to work to people losing their life savings. This also led to political changes across Germany as the public felt resentment towards the Weimar government. So in terms of obviously thinking about what kind of things we need to add to a 12-mark answer, I've already mentioned at the beginning the technique needed for this style question. So I'm going to pick out a few examples of this. So I did mention that you needed lots of specific facts and figures. So I'm just going to highlight a few examples. So here we've got some specific facts and figures. We've got quite a few here as well. We've got quite a few dates that are being used. We've got 66 years there as well, 132 people killed, 600 stormtroopers, 1 to 200 billion marks. There's lots and lots of different examples of specific facts and figures being used as part of the detail to explain these problems. So to explain the Treaty of Versailles and why it caused an issue, and then also to explain hyperinflation and why it caused an issue. Now you can see as well that there have been some direct links back to the question. So for example, in the first paragraph, when we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, we've talked about what the Treaty of Versailles, of course, was, but we haven't just described the treaty and moved on. We've talked about why the treaty affected the people. So we've talked about the fact that people suffered because they were now living under foreign rule. So that's to do with the territorial changes. We've also talked about having to accept blame and the problems that came with that and why people resented it. We've also talked about the impact of reparations and the fact that it led to the invasion of the Ruhr, which eventually led to hyperinflation, and the fact that, of course, that affected the German people. So we've basically not just described the treaty, we've made sure that throughout the answer, we are linking back to the question. And of course, you can do it slightly differently. You might talk about the Treaty of Versailles, and then you could do some examples at the end about why it affected German people. In this example, I've obviously entwined those parts together. But if you find it easier just to talk about this factor and then link back to the question at the end, that's fine as long as you give a couple of reasons. Try to go with more than one. So here, for example, I've given 3 different reasons for why the treaty affected people. So it's important that you try to do the same even if you were writing in a different format. In terms of the second paragraph, again, we've given lots of description about obviously the impact of hyperinflation, talking about the rise of prices, talking about people carrying their wages in wheelbarrows, the fact that pensioners and war widows, of course, lost their savings. And of course, part of that is explaining how it affected the German people. You've got to think, for example, if people are pensioners and they can't afford to eat on their pensions, they're going to have to go back to work. So, you know, that even though it's not necessarily mentioned in the question, it is something that's kind of clear through the impact that is mentioned from the hyperinflation crisis. We've also clearly talked about the fact that another impact of the hyperinflation crisis was political. And we've talked about the fact that the Munich Putsch was a direct link with hyperinflation, that the Nazis pounced at this stage because they felt that it was a weak point within the government, because they hadn't really been dealing with the hyperinflation crisis well enough. So essentially, guys, it's about kind of linking back again and talking about why those issues affected people. And of course, it affected people because it changed their political views in some ways and basically supported, attempts against the government. In the conclusion, it's important that you do make a really, really clear decision. So even though I've stated that both events had a huge impact, I've made it clear that I say that I think that hyperinflation had the greatest impact. And I've also explained why. Now, again, I've tried to link the factors together by suggesting that the Treaty of Versailles, of course, caused the issues that went on to trigger hyperinflation. So some people might say that the Treaty of Versailles was therefore more important. But for me, I would say that actually it's not, because it's the actual hyperinflation issue that leads to people like pensioners having to return to work and also people losing their life savings as well. So that's a massive issue. And of course, the political changes across Germany were also a huge problem for the government. So in terms of obviously the conclusion, guys, just make sure you've made a really clear judgment of which one is most important and try to make some links between the two factors to show that there are links between them. That's really quite a high skill thing to do in a conclusion. For our second question 6 example, I'm going to go through the question with you and give you the first 2 paragraphs as model paragraphs. But I am going to ask you to do the conclusion yourself. It's really effective if you can keep practicing how to answer questions in the conclusion, especially if you're trying to make links like I had done in the first example. So let's look at the question first of all. Which of the following was the most important reason why the Weimar Republic was in danger in the years 1919 to 1923? Were they more in danger because of economic problems? Or were they more in danger because of political unrest? So you might already have an opinion. You're going to basically listen to the first 2 paragraphs and then make a decision as a conclusion for yourself. But remember to keep looking back at the last example of a conclusion if you need any help. So here are the model paragraphs for the question worth 12 marks, which is which of the following was the more important reason why the Weimar Republic was in danger in the years 1919 to 1923? Was it because of economic or political problems? So I'm going to read through the paragraphs. I'm going to highlight some key things that I think are good about this answer, and then obviously you guys are going to need to do the conclusion after reading these 2 paragraphs. So let's go through the first one. The war had caused massive economic problems for Germany. Germany had borrowed large sums of money to cover war costs and were now left with massive debts. The war had left 600,000 war widows. All of these women were entitled to a pension. Factories were exhausted by war. Industrial production was about 2/3 of what it was in 1913, and national income was about 1/3 of what it had been. On top of this, they had to pay 6.6 billion to the Allies in reparations. These reparations are placing an economic strain on the country, causing inflation. Hyperinflation almost led to the collapse of Weimar Germany. The first problem caused by hyperinflation was economic and social. From the start of 1923, prices rose. Bread went up from 1 to 200 billion marks, and the value of a pound went up from 500 to 14 trillion marks. People got their wages in wheelbarrows. Money was used as a toy or as fuel, and people on fixed incomes and people with savings were ruined. There was social chaos, riots, and looting. All of this put the government in danger as people blamed them for these problems. So in terms of that first question, if you're unfamiliar with those facts and figures used at the beginning, they are something that we did revise at the end of the Kaiser section. So if you're unfamiliar with those statistics, you need to go back over and revise the Kaiser again, because those sections are there for the impact of World War I. So basically, again, you can see some examples of specific facts, figures and details, and also just links throughout about why this was a problem for the government, particularly talking about the fact that it causes inflation, which of course the government has to deal with. It also causes social chaos, riots and looting, and it also means that people blamed the government for their problems, and that's why it was a huge issue. It even almost led to the collapse of Weimar Germany, so that is a massive issue. Let's look at the second paragraph. Political unrest was a danger from the very beginning of the Republic. The first political rebellion was from the left. In January 1919, a communist rebellion of 50,000 Spartakists rebelled in Berlin. They were led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and there was brutal fighting in the streets of Berlin for 3 days. The rebellion was brutally crushed by the Freikorps, who were basically demobbed soldiers returning from the front. The leaders were executed. The second political rebellion was the right-wing Kapp Putsch of March 1920. This rebellion was by the Freikorps. They were ex-soldiers who refused to abide by the terms of the treaty and disband. They blamed the government, who they claimed had stabbed them in the back. It was led by Wolfgang Kapp and was supported by army generals, notably the war hero, General Ludendorff. The army refused to crush the rebellion. Troops don't fire on troops, and the government had to flee to Berlin. It was defeated when Ebert got the trade unions to mount a general strike. In 1923, there were a number of rebellions. One of the most serious issues was the Nazi Munich Putsch in November 1923. Hitler had planned a rebellion in Bavaria with the support of another right-wing politician, including the governor of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr. When Kahr hesitated, Hitler and 600 stormtroopers burst into a meeting at Beer Hall, where Kahr was speaking and forced him at gunpoint to declare a rebellion. The next day, with the Nazis and General Ludendorff, they marched on Munich. The Nazis were defeated in a short battle. Hitler was arrested. Each of these 3 rebellions caused serious danger for the government. So even though there's that connection at the end about the fact that they all cause danger for the government, it's about kind of you've got to kind of read between the lines a little bit, I suppose. They could be more explicit with links back to the question here. But like, for example, if the army refuses to crush the rebellion, you could perhaps think about the fact that that clearly shows that the problem for the government if the army aren't listening. The government had to flee to Berlin. There was a number of rebellions. The government were believed to have stabbed the army in the back. Of course, that's an issue of people, again, are blaming the government for Germany's problems. These are all issues for Weimar, okay? Now, what you've got to do in the conclusion is you've now got to explain which of these problems was the most important and why. Now, remember, it would be really good if you can state which one is the most important, but as part of your argument, link it with the other factor. Have another look at the last conclusion if you think you need a bit of support again on how to do that. But essentially, I'd like everybody to now have a go at writing the conclusion for this 12-mark question. Pause the video here so that you can do that. Okay, Year 11s, this is our third example for question 6. To see you do questions, this means you're going to have a go at doing this one on your own. The question is, which of the following was the more important reason why Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933? Was it because of economic weaknesses or political weaknesses of Weimar Germany? Now, some of you might be a bit unsure about the wording of this question, and you might want a bit of support before you get started. So let's have a quick chat about how you would approach this question. So you do one paragraph about the economic weaknesses, and of course you do one about the political weaknesses. But what does that mean? Well, for economic weaknesses, you do know what it means. It's just that the wording's a bit funny. For this section, you've got to talk about the Great Depression in 1929. You've got to talk about how the government dealt with this economic problem. So mention the rises of unemployment, mention the fact that Bruning's government cut social benefits, mention the fact that the government was quite unstable at this stage, and that of course kind of fell into Hitler's hands because he was able to offer people a more stable government. You could also talk about the fact that at this stage, Hindenburg was ruling quite often with Article 48, and that was kind of undermining democracy at this stage. And also you could mention the fact that at this point, Hitler was saying all the right things in his speeches for the Great Depression, wasn't he? He was promising people work and bread at a time when that's exactly what people wanted. And you could mention the fact that this made a really big change to the election results, and you could use the statistics of the election results to back that up. In terms of political weaknesses, that's kind of like the political weaknesses of Weimar from the beginning. So you can mention lots of things here. You could talk about the fact that the government was still hated for signing the Treaty of Versailles, for reparations, even the Dawes Plan. You could mention the fact that they were still blamed for the armistice and they were referred to as the November criminals. You could talk about the stab in the back theory. You could also talk about the fact that proportional representation was a weakness from the beginning. And actually that's one of the reasons Hitler was able to get into power, because proportional representation allowed smaller groups to get in. You could also talk about Article 48, giving the president the right to rule by decree. That again is like undermining democracy. You could talk about how that might help Hitler. And also, don't forget the right-wing judges and officials. They are also there helping Hitler, essentially, to get to the position of Chancellor. Not directly, but indirectly, they are helping him. So in that sense, guys, I'd like you to basically use those examples of economic issues within Weimar Germany that helped Hitler to get into power. And then the second paragraph is about political weaknesses of the government and why that helped Hitler get into power. In the end, you're going to need to do a conclusion with your opinion. So make sure that, again, you do try to make it really, really clear which one is most important. And again, try to make some links between the two factors if you can. It just make a really good conclusion. Now, this is the end of our lesson now, Year 11, so I'm going to leave you to get on with this 12 marker. Remember, it's supposed to take you 15 minutes to write. So go and get on with that, and don't forget to send your answer to your teacher with feedback straight after you've finished. Thank you for listening, and take care.